There is a cave. Limestone. Dark. Cut into the rock above the Dead Sea. In a place called Qumran, where the desert meets the water and nothing else grows. Inside that cave, for 2,000 years, something waited. Not treasure. Not weapons. Leather. Thin as dried skin. Pressed flat under 2 millennia of silence. Words scratched into it in Aramaic, a language that was already ancient when the cave was sealed. Most of it rotted. Most of it turned to dust before anyone found it. What remained was enough to tell us about one journey. One figure. One night when the largest creatures on earth held their breath and sent the only one among them who had a chance of being heard. His name was Mahway, son of the Watcher Barakel. His wings dark, vast, heavy with the dust of 1,000 miles were folded tight against his back. Not spread for display. Not raised in thread. Folded. The way you fold something you are not sure you will ever use again. He did not carry a weapon. What he carried was a message, and the message was a question the Council of Giants had been too afraid to ask themselves. Are we already dead? The room had gone quiet after the two brothers finished speaking. Haya. Oh yeah. They had each dreamed the same thing, separately, on the same night. A garden, every tree pulled from the root. A stone tablet, every name on it washed clean. No one spoke for a long time after that. These were not creatures built for silence. The Nephilim filled space by nature, by size, by sound, by the particular weight that comes from bodies twice the height of any man. Silence was not their language. But the dreams had done something that war and hunger and centuries of dominance had never managed to do. The dreams had made them small. They needed an answer. A real one. Not from each other. Not from the Watchers who had fathered them into an existence no scripture had planned for. They needed it from someone who stood close enough to heaven to speak its language. There was only one such person. Enoch. The scribe. The one man who had walked out of ordinary human life and never come back. They looked at Mahway. He did not ask why. He already knew. Before we follow him into the sky, we need to be honest about what we are working with. The story you are about to hear does not come from a complete book. It does not arrive with clean margins and careful chapter headings. It comes from fragments, pieces of leather recovered from Cave 4 at Qumran, catalogued under the designations 4Q530 and 4Q531. Some pieces are the size of a bomb. Some are smaller. The gaps between them are not filled. They are simply gone. The parchment dissolved. The ink vanished. Whatever those missing lines said, they said it to no one. What scholars like Professor Lorenz Stuckenbrook, 1997 critical edition of the Book of Giants remains the standard reference in the field, have worked to reconstruct is the shape of the narrative. Not the complete text. The shape. The logic. The sequence of events that the surviving lines imply. And what that shape tells us is this: after the two dreams were presented to the council, the giants reached a conclusion. They could not decode the visions themselves. The imagery was too precise, too deliberate. The stripped garden, the washed tablet, to be dismissed as ordinary nightmare. It carried the grammar of divine communication. And none of them spoke that grammar. Enoch did. The scribe of righteousness had been removed from ordinary human life, taken, in the language of the early texts, to a place at the edge of the inhabited world. Some traditions placed him beyond the desert, some beyond the mountains. The fragments do not specify the geography with precision. They specify only that he was reachable, but barely, and only by someone with the right blood to make the crossing. The council chose Mahway, son of the Watcher Barakel. They chose him not because he was the loudest voice in the room. The fragments do not preserve a speech, a competition, a debate. They suggest something quieter than that. They looked at him. He stepped forward. That was all. His father Barakel was one of the named Watchers, one of the 200 who had descended onto Mount Hermon and entered into the compact that set all of this in motion. That lineage ran in Mahway's blood in ways that could not be hidden and could not be borrowed. It was the only credential that mattered for what he was being asked to do. The mandate was simple. Find Enoch. Present the dreams. Receive the interpretation. Return with whatever he said. Even if it was the answer they feared. Especially if it was that. The surviving Aramaic describes the motion as something like eagles. Not the slow, labored flapping of a creature learning to fly. Something faster than that. Something that had been waiting, held folded and still through the entire council, through the long silence after the dreams, through the moment of choosing, and was now released. His wings opened over the desert at dawn. Dark against the pale ochre sky. Vast enough to throw a shadow on the sand below that moved like a storm front, crossing terrain that would take a man days to walk in a matter of hours. The feathers black, heavy, edged with the particular dullness of something that has never been decorative, cut through the dry air with a sound like distant thunder. But there was no triumph in it. That is the thing the fragments preserve most clearly in the texture of this scene. He was not soaring. He was crossing. The difference is everything. What moved him was inheritance, and something heavier than inheritance. His father Barakel had descended from a realm where distance worked differently. Something of that capacity had passed to Mahway at birth, in his blood and in his wingspan, in the specific way his body existed between two worlds that were not meant to overlap. He used it now, because there was no other option. Because the council had looked at him and he had stepped forward and the mandate was already done. The desert below him was the eastern wilderness. Ancient. Enormous. The kind of landscape that makes every human settlement look like an accident, a temporary arrangement of mud and stone that the sand is slowly reclaiming. There were no roads. There were no fires on any horizon. There was only the rock and the heat and the silence of a world that had not yet decided what it was. Mahway would have felt the altitude in his lungs. A body his size, twice the height of any man, carrying the proportional weight of that scale, generates its own heat. At elevation, in the furnace air above the eastern desert, The two temperatures press against each other. The body produces heat. The sky returns it. He kept moving. East. Always east. Below him, the last traces of the Nephilim settlements fell away. Structures cut from stone at a scale that no ordinary human hand could have managed, doorways the height of trees, walls thick enough to muffle thunder. The physical record of what the hybrid race had built in the centuries since their fathers descended. Permanent. Defiant. Already, in certain ways, beginning to look like ruins. He did not look back. The fragments do not preserve his thoughts during the flight. We do not have an internal record of what he carried in his mind across that empty sky. What the narrative logic suggests from the shape of the scene, from the weight of what he had been sent to ask, is that this was not a journey made in hope. He was not flying toward a rescue. He was flying toward a verdict. And somewhere in the long hours above the desert, with the horizon ahead refusing to resolve into anything recognizable, that distinction would have pressed itself against him the way heat presses against skin. Unavoidable. Specific. Already decided. The sand below kept its silence. The sky above offered nothing. He kept moving. And then something stopped him. The scholarly reconstructions of 4Q531 describe a moment in the journey where the flight encounters a limit. The fragments are damaged at this point, the lines break off, the leather thins, and what survives is partial. But the shape of what happened is recoverable. Mahway had moved far enough east, and high enough, that he was approaching a threshold the fragments associate with the celestial order. Not a wall. Not a visible boundary. Something that announced itself through the body before the mind could name it. The heat changed. Not the desert heat he had been flying through for hours. Something older than that. Something that had nothing to do with sand or altitude or the angle of the sun. The fragments describe an intensity that threatened his body in a way that distance and exhaustion had not. He faltered. Consider what that word means for a creature like Mahway. He had crossed a desert in a single flight. He had held the mandate of the entire Nephilim Council in his body without breaking. He was built by birth, by lineage, by the specific combination of earth and heaven that had produced him for exactly this kind of crossing. And now he could not move forward. The power that had carried him this far was not sufficient for what lay ahead. The inherited capacity from his father Barakel, the thing in his blood that no purely human creature possessed, had a ceiling. And he had reached it. He did not ask another question. The fragments do not record a struggle, a second attempt, a refusal to accept the limit. What they preserve in the broken lines that survived 2,000 years of darkness is the moment of a voice. A command. Spoken from somewhere above or ahead of him, in the direction he could no longer travel. Stop. The specific words are not fully preserved. The Aramaic at this point in 4Q531 is among the most damaged sections of the fragment. What scholars can reconstruct from the surrounding lines is the function of the intervention. Mahway was halted. His trajectory was redirected. And within the redirection was embedded a location, the place where Enoch could be found. He had been flying toward the wrong destination. Or perhaps toward the right one, by a route that would have destroyed him before he arrived. He turned. Not in defeat. Not in surrender. With the specific, quiet compliance of someone who has just understood that the rules of this crossing were never his to determine. He descended toward the edge of the inhabited world. Toward the place where the desert met something the maps of that era had no name for. Toward Enoch. The scholarly reconstruction of the encounter is built primarily from 4Q 530. Fragment 2. The parchment is damaged. There are gaps in the dialogue. But the shape of what passed between them is clear. Enoch was not surprised. That detail carried in the tone of the surviving lines rather than stated explicitly says more than most of what follows. The scribe of righteousness received Mahway the way a man receives the letter he has been expecting. He did not step back. He did not ask why a giant had appeared at the edge of his dwelling. He waited. Mahway delivered the dreams. Faithfully. The stripped garden, every root pulled, every tree gone, only scorched earth remaining. The washed tablet, every name removed, the stone left clean and blank. Both visions. Both brothers. No addition. No editorial comment. No attempt to shape the telling toward a more favorable interpretation. He was a messenger. He delivered the message. Enoch listened. The fragments suggest a pause here, a gap in the surviving text that may represent exactly what it looks like. A silence. The space between the question being fully asked and the answer being given. Then he spoke. The judgment was confirmed. The decree was not negotiable. The garden would be stripped. The tablet would be washed. The cleansing described in the visions was not a warning, it was a schedule. Already in motion. Already irreversible. Water. An amount of water the world had not previously held in a single event. Not rain. Not flood in the ordinary sense. Something that the texts elsewhere describe as the opening of storehouses, reserves built into the structure of the sky itself, held back until the moment they were needed. No exemptions. The fragments do not record Enoch offering a secondary process, a petition pathway, a consideration for lineages with partial divine heritage. The surviving lines do not preserve that conversation because the text implies it did not happen. There was nothing to negotiate. The compact made on the summit of Mount Hermon, the decision by 200 watchers to descend, to cross the boundary between their kind and humanity, to father children into a world that had no category for what those children would become. That decision had a consequence. The consequence had been set in motion. It could not be recalled. Mahway did not ask another question. The fragments do not record one. Whether this means he had nothing left to say, or whether the text was lost at that point, we cannot know. What we can read in the silence that follows is the specific weight of a mission completed in the worst possible way. He had crossed the desert. He had reached the boundary and been turned back from it. He had found Enoch at the edge of the world. And Enoch had told him the truth. The dreams were not warnings. They were descriptions. The garden was already gone. In every way that mattered. The names on the tablet were already fading. The water was coming. There was nothing left to do. Enoch said nothing more. He did not soften it. He did not add a gesture of comfort at the end. The scribe of righteousness had read the divine signs faithfully and delivered them faithfully. His job was done. What Mahway did with the verdict was no longer Enoch's concern. Mahway turned west. The desert was the same desert he had crossed to get here. Same rock. Same silence. Same heat pressing down from above and rising from below. But he was carrying something different now. Not hope. Not a strategy. Not even grief. Exactly, grief requires surprise. And somewhere in the long flight east, the surprise had already been used up. He was carrying a confirmation. The council would be waiting. The same room. The same silence they had fallen into after the brothers finished speaking. They would hear him land. They would look at his face before he said a word. And his face would tell them most of it before he opened his mouth. He had gone east as a question. He was returning as an answer. The fragments do not detail the return journey. The surviving Aramaic gives us the departure, the boundary, the verdict, and then the parchment thins and breaks and the rest is gap. We do not have the scene where Mahway lands. We do not have the moment the council receives what he brings back. Perhaps that is the most honest thing the text can offer. Not a resolution. Not a final act of defiance or acceptance. Just the moment before the return held in a single figure, flying west above an empty desert, carrying a verdict no one can undo. The sky above him was already different. The light had changed in some quality that the ordinary eye might not name but the body would recognize. A pressure in the atmosphere. A density in the clouds gathering at the far edge of the horizon. The ancient texts describe it elsewhere. The windows of heaven. The fountains of the deep. The opening of storehouses that had been sealed since the beginning. Mahway flew beneath that sky. The Dead Sea Scrolls gave us this much: a giant crossing a burning desert on dark wings, reaching a boundary he could not pass, receiving the verdict that could not be changed, turning home. Broken fragments. Aramaic pressed into leather. 2,000 years in a limestone cave. That is what survived. And somehow it is enough to see him clearly. Flying west. Into the gathering dark. So tell me in the comments honestly, when a system realizes it has crossed the point of no return, is it better to know the exact hour of the end or to live in the brief illusion of safety? Let me know below. To follow Mahway back to the doomed council and witness the final hours before the windows of heaven open, subscribe. The countdown to the water has begun.
Enter the realm of divine secrets. Welcome to Bible Confidential.